October 30th, we're back at 21 Soho with Ian Brodie talking about life in and out of the Lightning Seeds and John Higgs on the KLF. Tickets below.
Welcome to another edition of Word in Your Ear, the godfather of British independent labels, immediate home of the Small Faces and the Nice and Nico and PP Arnold and various others, had a wonderful slogan which was happy to be part of the industry of human happiness. And this small but perfectly formed book delightfully explains why. And we're joined by its author, Simon Spence. Simon, it's lovely to see you.
Yeah, good morning. It's nice to see you both again. I'm glad you had me back because last time I had a bookshelf behind me and the highlight of the hour talking about Steve Marriott was me knocking the books down accidentally.
Oh, right. Okay.
Very memorable.
Memorable.
Can't be done again.
No, I rambled on about Steve Marriott. You know, it was delayed during the pandemic and it was sort of like a bit distant from me, whereas this immediate book is much more, I guess it's much more personal and it's much more recent, you know. So,
well, we're going to start by saying that Immediate obviously was co-founded by Tony Calder and Andrew Oldham, the former Stones manager, and a lot of it's based around your this book is based around your interviews with Andrew Oldham, and with whom you built quite a relationship because you were the ghostwriter or co-author of Stoned and Too Stoned, weren't you? His memoirs. So how did that come about? How did you get to meet him and work with him?
Well, I'm prepared this time because...
all right, there's your books.
There's Stoned and Too Stoned. So Andrew says, I remind him of the son he never wanted. That was his quote about me in 91. Yeah. And I reciprocate in the immediate book by saying... He was like the father figure to me. He was like a father that, I can't even remember what I wrote now, but he was like the father I never wanted. You know, it was like that. It's been a long relationship with Andrew for 42 years now I've known him.
But how did you get to be working with him? How did that come about?
32. I met him when I was a young journalist in London and I was writing for The Face magazine. And I proposed going to Bogota, Colombia, where he lives, and interviewing for The Face. And that's the first time I met him, 91, out in Bogota. And I write about it in the book. It was no sleep for 7 days and a lot of excess. And then we kept in contact, and in 96, he was in Argentina producing the Ratones Paranoicos, the Paranoid Mice, because they're Argentina's biggest band, like U2 in Argentina. And he was producing them, and he'd had a lifestyle change, and he'd got clean. And we started in earnest on Stoned and Too Stoned in 96. So that was 4 years of pretty intense work to 2000, good fun, and we've kept in touch since, ups and downs. Can I do this, Andrew? No. You're you know, he can be quite a
mercurial.
Yeah. I was going to swear, but yeah,
I'm just picking a word out of the air. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So it's been it's a difficult relationship. It's like, I stand corrected, 42 years, 1991, so 32 years I've known him. And for me, is number one, you know, is like I did talk about Steve Marriott, and kids today, you know, you say the Rolling Stones, okay, you've got their attention. You say the Rolling Stones manager, and immediately they're onto TikTok to something else, you know. So it's difficult. I don't know, like when we're doing these kind of things, and you two have had long distinguished careers in music journalism, it's of interest to me, the manager and the producer of the Rolling Stones and the first independent record label. But I'm not sure how much it resonates with youngsters today. That's why the book is pocket-sized.
Yeah.
Because you haven't got room on your shelf for loads of books, particularly big books. Whereas kids today, you can put it in your pocket and say someone's coming at you with an air rifle. Yeah, that could stop a bullet. And a machete.
Right. No, we got the message here.
Yeah. It could save your life.
In many ways, a useful and practical book.
Keep it on the tube, keep it on the...
No, that's good. So look, Oldham, I just want to ask you one question about Oldham. Is that, and we're going to get on to Immediate in a moment, and the control he had in every aspect of Immediate was fantastic. But it's the same with the Stones in a way. Do you think the Stones would ever have succeeded without him being the person who decided the composition of the group and what they were going to play and what they looked like and the publicity? I mean, it was amazing, wasn't it?
Yeah, no Andrew Loog Oldham, no Rolling Stones.
True, isn't it?
Yeah, it's unquestionable, isn't it, really? Yeah. I mean, because he took them when he was 19. He was only 19 when he became their manager, and that was 1963. And 63 to 67, I mean, was just this golden period, wasn't it, for the Stones? And that's what their career was really built on, you know. I mean, and it's still going on. You know, Ruby Tuesday, Let's Spend the Night Together, Paint It Black, Satisfaction. I mean, these are all Andrew Loog Oldham productions, you know. But I feel... I will say very much like Immediate was a two fingers, you know, because before the happiness to be happy, it was the little bastard, you know, that was the strap line, because they were two fingers up to the establishment. So
why did he bother? I mean, you would have thought you'd be immensely busy being the manager of the Rolling Stones, and you're 21 years old or whatever he was by then. And why start a record company? You know, nobody else did it. Why did they want to do it? Did they want to get rich?
I don't think money was the driving force initially. I think Andrew and Tony, the co-founders, had spent a lot. Well, Andrew particularly had spent a lot of time in America, and he'd struggled with his productions, apart from the Rolling Stones, with Decca Records. So Marianne Faithfull was a hit for Andrew, but he had other bands like the Poets from Glasgow, who John Lennon loved. He had struggles with Decca to get the promotion, you know, so he felt the records he was producing outside of the Stones, and Decca Records thought Andrew was mad as a hatter. I mean, he was, no doubt about it, but he was producing great records. So they kind of put up with him for the Stones, 7 consecutive number ones in the UK, 7, and about 5 in America, these consecutive UK. And that's just the singles, the albums. 7, I mean, US 9, in 63 to 67, 9 US number 1 albums.
But just on the point of why he started the label, I mean, some of it must have been to do with a idealistic thing about, I mean, the general consensus was that the big labels were kind of ripping off and taking advantage of the innocent young groups. Yeah. So was there some element of, we're going to run a label here, run by people the same age as you, and you're going to get a better deal? And was that part of it, do you think?
It's so difficult for me to go back to that, what it was like in 1965. But I think it was. I think that was part of that, what you can't really bottle, the essence of that. I guess it was a revolution, you know, cultural revolution. You know, and I think that was part of it, you know, it was, no, I mean, Andrew used to call the record labels funeral parlors. So it was like taking the American influence and bringing it to England and just having like a lot of fun. And I think by the time he started Immediate Records in 65, Satisfaction was number 1. He was a millionaire. And like you say, he was only 21. And he was already quite heavily into drugs and drink. And So while part of it was idealistic, I guess he thought he could walk on water.
Absolutely.
I'm sure, absolutely. But he also, there's an element of it. You kind of think that it was going to be intensely fashionable, intensely hip, which it was, because it was, his image and Tony's image to a lesser extent. But actually, groups. The first big hit was "Hang On, Sloopy," wasn't it, by the McCoys? So
I'll spare you a rendition of that.
What's that?
I'll spare you a rendition of that.
Oh, fair enough. But so it wasn't just about image. It just a lot of it was to do with kind of his commercial ear, wasn't it, for a hit?
Well, yeah, because that came from Burt Burns, Twist and Shout, Burt Burns. So it was already a number one in America, and he was a friend of Andrew's. So Burt Burns became part of immediate. I mean, it was really just a gathering of people around Andrew and the Stones. But in terms of image, I think they were always, I think from day one, image was almost as important as the music, because they had Nico.
Yeah.
For the second single was Nico 2 years before she joined the Velvet Underground. So she looked the part, Nico. I'm not saying the single was, because Jimmy Page was the staff producer. So Jimmy Page and Andrew wrote that Nico song. So I guess it was a gathering of people who I guess were hip, I mean, Andrew, the Stones, Steve Marriott, the Small Faces, Nico, and Tony and Andrew. I mean, that was really the core of it at the start. And Tony King, who's recently released a book, was there as well.
Well, there's a lot of these people we've spoken to on this podcast. Because Gerard Mankiewicz obviously was the kind of 20-year-old photographer who created the images of loads of these people,
Yeah, so Gerard Mankiewicz was another at the start. So it is this core of people who actually...
Because it was...
some of the independent labels, I think, have a problem with flash in the pan. But if you look at the careers of everyone involved in immediate, Jimmy Page, John Paul Jones, Andrew, Tony, the Stones, Steve Marriott, like we say, Gerard, Tony King, all these people have got hugely impressive careers. So it's a pretty heavy label, I mean, Atlantic is a heavy label, right? In America. I mean, Immediate is a pretty heavy label.
But the interesting thing to me about reading your book, and it is fascinating, is I kind of lived through this period and I wasn't aware of half of these singles that came out, you know what I mean? And because he adopted a policy based on having been a record plugger, I suppose, or a PR man, which is if you can't get radio behind any of these things, forget it. Just move on to the next thing. So a lot of these records are hardly pressed. Is that the case?
Yeah. There's an incredible catalog, and they did move on fast. So you'll get the Turtles, You Baby, or the Changing of the Guard, which was the Kinks, the Who, or Green Circles. Yeah. So all these artists are recording stuff for Immediate. Rod Stewart recording, Scott Walker recording for Immediate, Fleetwood Mac recording for Immediate.
Yeah.
But it was all quite, as Andrew got faster and faster and faster, the label got faster and faster and faster. So I think it was recently reviewed by Den Brown, who turned Tony Wilson onto punk, and he said, "Thank you for turning me on to the." I'm not sure he'll thank me later. Thank you for turning me on to Twice as Much.
Right.
A mid '67 Beach Boys-esque group, and another maybe Billy Nichols, who's great. Billy Nichols, So there are some gems on there. On Immediate, on the label.
But Andrew had an absolute genius for publicity, which you talk about a lot, which is fun. We'll talk about his own personal publicity in a minute. But, I mean, it was things like, selling Chris Farlow's Out of Time as being something produced by Mick Jagger was a brilliant maneuver, because it wasn't, was it? I mean, Mick Jagger really involved? He might have co-written the song, but he wasn't involved in the production. But
Well, it was the same. It's similar to the first debut solo Keith Richard album, which came out in 65. And that was like, he said, Andrew said, oh, it's the first for any Beatle or any Stone. It's a debut solo album. Now, whether Keith Richards actually was in the studio or but his name was on the
Keith
cover.
Richards Orchestra record?
His name, same as Mick's name was, and there was a photograph of Mick with his arm round Chris Farlow.
Yeah.
So it was all about pushing Mick and Keith early
Which
on.
was the Keith record? Was it the Keith Richards Orchestra album? Was that the one you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was. I think in the end it got called Keith Richard and the R&B Orchestra, something like that. But yeah, first debut solo album by Keith Richard. So I know, because someone mentioned it, that Talk Is Cheap is meant to be his first solo album, but it's definitely this one. And they've got Sam Cooke as well, Twinkle. It's just a credible record, Twinkle.
They've also got. I was fascinated by the story of is it Jimmy Page and Eric Clapton jamming that album that came out, which that they always say that it was taped behind the sofa. Eric Clapton didn't even know he was making a record, but it came out immediately.
Did they fall out? Didn't Eric Clapton, was he furious that Jimmy Page had given the tapes to Immediate or whatever?
Well, Jimmy Page was very young when he started at Immediate. He was 65. But interestingly, Immediate often paired Jimmy Page with John Paul Jones. So a good slew of those early Immediate recordings are kind of proto-Led Zepp. I mean, it's the two guys from Led Zepp. But I think with that... when we said Immediate started and it was, the big record labels were ripping off the artists. That's true. So the royalties went from 2% for the Beatles, and then Small Face was 5%. But at the same time, Immediate were also quite gangsterish.
Yes,
I would say.
Yeah.
And so illegal recordings of Eric Clapton, as done by Jimmy Page, and they did fall out about it. And I do think Jimmy Page probably got caught up in a bit of... Tony Calder was very wide. Tony Calder, very wide. And Jimmy Page was more friendly with Tony than he was with Andrew. So perhaps Jimmy got caught up in a bit of that rough and tumble.
With Peter Grant, it's all it's all the same thing, isn't it?
And Don Arden later on.
They were broader than Broadway. People, no doubt about it at all. I remember
that's the way it was. Yeah,
you refer to in this book. I think you were probably. I first met Andrew Oldham in the early 90s when he was trying to relaunch Immediate in the UK. Was that Immediate 3 or something? He was trying to do it.
Yeah.
And he was based in a hotel just off Sloane Square in Chelsea, holding court, very, very much chemically heightened and, talking it up for all it was worth. And his whole attitude was, and he said, if you didn't want to be ripped off, why are you in the record business? Because that's the way. It just goes with the territory, That seemed to be his attitude. Is that what you found?
That was a particularly dark period for Andrew. I would say it was difficult for him after the Rolling Stones because I think Nick Cohen said it, how do you follow that? How do you follow those monsters? What do you do for the rest of your life? You've cut your monsters by the time you're 21. What do you do for the rest of your life? And I think maybe got through the 70s and the 80s were difficult. And I think then early 90s, he was in quite a state. He was in we know he was, because I'd seen him privately, when with the Primal Scream Wrecking Crew. which was as bad as his behavior in those hotels that you talk about. I mean, the publicity. We'd started working on Stoned then, and I mean, I will try and say not mercurial, but I will say he could be a bit of a cunt.
Yes.
I'm sure.
But
then again,
I write that in the book. He could be, and he was. I mean, when they say to me in the bookshops, "What was he like?" I'd love to know. I bet that's interesting. I say, yeah, he was like king of the cunts.
But I mean, you could argue that you needed to be.
In a way.
You talk about him signing the Small Faces. So, legend has it that that the deal was done with £25,000 in a paper bag delivered to Don Arden. I mean, is that the case, or or is that just apocrypha?
No, I think what happened was Don had got them tied to Decca somehow, and he said he could get them free from Decca. So that was Don. Andrew got Alan Klein to, I don't know how you got money in those days, telexed him. I don't think it was that, but I don't know, maybe telexed him £25,000 from the Stones' earnings. Don't forget, Alan Klein had said in 1967 the Stones were going to gross £30 million. So Andrew was quids in. So he got £25,000 and he put it in a brown envelope and he gave it to Don. And Don got them free of Decca. But that was a new lease of life for the Small Faces, wasn't it?
The biggest advance paid for anyone apart from the Yardbirds, who I think got about the same amount. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, it was an industry record. Because you are thinking, I don't know, I'm flippant about the 60s a little bit, but, CBS in America were going great guns with Janis Joplin and Bob Dylan and stuff. So you kind of are looking at music industry history, I guess. UK.
Yeah.
Just going back to Small Faces for a second. It looked to me from reading your book that he applied exactly the same technique the Small Faces did to the Stones, really. That he came in there, he told them what to play. He was running their A&R. He was, overseeing the look of the group and shaped them from every angle. Is that true?
I would say so, but in a slightly more mature way than he had with the Stones, more of a back seat. So I think he was very controlling, wasn't he, of the Rolling Stones? He was. I mean, famously. He sacked Ian Stewart because his chin was too big. His chin was too big, so he sacked him. This is like straight away. Then he said, "You've got to put the G back on the end of the Rolling Stone." Then he famously made Mick and Keith write songs, locked them in a room together, and said, "You aren't coming out." I mean, these are apocryphal stories, but they are true. And then, so Satisfaction, they said, "Oh no, we're not having that, Andrew." And Andrew just stuck it out. Satisfaction, produced by Andrew Loog Oldham.
Well, Out of Time, Chris Farlow, they didn't think was a single.
No, so Andrew is an incredible figure. If you think about it, an incredible figure. And with the Small Faces, he wouldn't put produced by Andrew Loog Oldham on those sleeves like he did with the Stones. But he was there and always around in the studio if needed. And then he would go in and he would, for instance, he picked Lazy Sunday as a single, when the group didn't really want that.
That's right.
It's amazing.
It's like one of the defining 60s hits, really, Lazy Sunday.
Isn't the key thing in the immediate story, and the reason it stopped, because the Small Faces didn't make it in America?
I think that was a key issue. The key moment, when it could have gone either way. Like Tony, when I kept in touch with Tony as well through his later life, and Tony died only a couple of years ago, and still Tony and Andrew would have said we could have been like Virgin.
Yeah.
We could have, I don't know what Virgin.
Well, if you needed tubular bells, don't you? You know, you need a few of those. And that's the problem with independent labels. You need a steady stream of hits. And you don't get them. You get one big one, then you get nothing, then you get another big one. And it's very difficult to manage that process. And with the second deal that they had, because the first deal they had was with Philips, where Philips were taking the entire financial risk, weren't they? And then the second deal they had was with EMI, where they were taking the financial risk. Is that the case?
Yeah, with EMI, they were both distribution deals for the UK, but with it, when they went from 65 to 67 with Philips, but then 67, EMI they wanted to expand into Europe. And I think at the time, EMI had different offices in every European country.
Yeah.
And then Andrew and Tony invented this thing where they would travel around Europe, meeting all these labels. And the managing director of EMI at the time, Ken East, said, actually, Immediate was a great help bringing EMI together to be, more of a coherent one in Europe. But they all said America was where the main money was. And so Steve would sit there watching Eric Clapton, or I don't know the names of the other groups, but Led Zeppelin being big in America. And that was what Steve wanted. That's what Steve wanted. And I guess Andrew couldn't give a monkeys, I don't think. He wasn't bothered, he'd been there and done America, hadn't he, really? With the Stones. So, but financially, I think it would have helped if the Small Faces would have had a hit album in America, at least, one.
Yeah.
Really.
And he fell out with CBS too, I think, didn't he? And also wasn't there the controversy about the advert, the Kennedy-related advert for the Nice?
Well, Andrew started to not be very diplomatic, so anti-Vietnam War. So he used, like you would say, was controlling. So the Nice, I don't know if you've heard of the Nice.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah, the Nice, he made them put that burn the American flag on stage. Shocking adverts. So part of it, although Andrew said it was never a hobby horse.
But it was an advert, wasn't it? Specifically where the three members were wearing JFK, Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King masks. Is that right?
Yeah.
With the slogan saying it's taken them, America, 475 years to find itself, and they're still looking. They took the Nice 7 minutes, 20 seconds or something. I mean, that is just unbelievable, really, isn't it?
I think it was an instrumental, that song. It was Stephen's song.
It's West Side Story, isn't it? I mean, that was the thing. It's a standard instrumental version of a tune from West Side Story. But then at the end, you get a child's voice saying, and I can remember this from 1968, whatever. America was pregnant with promise and possibility, but was murdered by the hand of the inevitable. That was the end of the record. And that must have been Andrew Oldham's idea. I don't think that would occur to Keith Emerson.
No, it was, and that was P.P. Arnold's daughter.
Was it?
Wow.
The voice.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary. Another connection to the word in your ear. We talked to P.P. Arnold.
Yeah.
Yes.
But then with that America, so then you talked about EMI, but in America they had distribution with CBS,
Right?
Which was Clive Davis, who's still going, and then Andrew really fell out with Clive Davis. I think they say Clive Davis went to Monterey and he signed Lou Adler and Andrew Oldham, and he thought he was going to get the Mamas and Papas and the Rolling Stones, and he got neither. And then he wouldn't promote Immediate properly, Andrew felt. And they had a big falling out. So Andrew threatened to kill Clive Davis. And, he was, what was he? He was like 23, 24. I mean, he was having electroshock therapy. He was having electroshock therapy. and he was going to put to sleep by Tony Hancock's doctor for a week. This is while he's running the record label. While he's running the record label, he's going for electric shock therapy, and he's being advised to be put
by
to sleep.
Tony Hancock's doctor.
By Tony Hancock.
Yeah, Tony Hancock's doctor, who didn't have a very good record, because Tony Hancock had died not long ago.
Yeah,
exactly. And Jet Harris, he treated Jet Harris.
Oh, God. I've had them all. I've had them all in the back of my cab. Yeah, Harris, Tony Hancock. Yes, pull up a chair.
Yeah.
So it's what's the kind of afterlife of Immediate? I mean, somebody still owns the catalogue now, do they? I mean, does it get passed around from one owner to another?
Well, the Small Faces were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And at the same time, the surviving members, which is only one now, isn't it, Kenny Jones, the drummer?
Yeah.
They reissued all the classic Immediate albums from that period. And I think Rob Kiger, who ran Immediate Records for Charlie, because it went through Sanctuary, EMI still owned the publishing, which is the big potato.
Right.
And, so it went through various hands, but for 40 years, Andrew Loog Oldham had nothing to do with it. Although Tony came back in on the scene with Patrick Meehan, who was a gangster, Patrick Meehan Senior or Junior, another of Don Arden's pals. It was all got very messy in the 70s. In fact, Don Arden threatened to kill Tony Calder. What's the matter? Did someone forget to pull the trigger? But then Andrew never had anything to do with it when it was Castle, Sanctuary, now Charlie. So this Immediate book is the first actual thing that has been sanctioned by Andrew in about 40 years. But all the box sets have come out since CD, when the CD boom, I guess, was first great reissuing wave. So I think it still does quite well with box sets and for collectors, but
it's just amazing that the kind of, I was listening to one of the box sets yesterday, and just the sheer amount of it is what is absolutely startling. The amount of stuff they put out in quite a short period of time, it is just something else.
And the range too. Yeah, Jimmy Tarbuck. Did you know Jimmy Tarbuck was on Immediate? I didn't. Astonishing.
Jimmy Tarbuck. I've not listened to that, but I do sometimes listen to Twinkle and Soldier's Dream by Twinkle. And there's another one, a later one, by a band called The Hill, who I've never heard of before or after. Sylvie, which is my youngest daughter's name. And that's a great song, Sylvie. Oh, and we've forgotten the Caravan Lady. The lady who went to
Vashti Bunyan?
Vashti Bunyan, yeah. So she was another Immediate act.
I suppose that's the virtue of appointing your hairdresser as A&R man, because that's what Andrew Oldham did at one point, didn't he?
Oh, I'm pleased you mentioned that, because I was thinking about that. Why I loved Immediate was not only was the managing director having electric shock, but the hairdresser was left in charge. I mean, wow. What a way to go.
And I think it proves that it's, the kind of putting a pin in the list of artists is every bit as credible a way of forming an A&R policy as the most scientific alternative you can possibly imagine. Because your number of hits probably is going to be no greater or no smaller if you appoint your hairdresser and say, just get anything you fancy.
Well, they did that. They appointed the hairdresser, and then in 1968, when the music industry was getting quite serious, they mocked up a group and made some demos and a picture of the group, and they took them round all the record labels. The hairdresser took them round, I think, and taped the conversations he was having with all the sort of now serious, I make decisions about what the kids will hear sort of thing. And they taped it all and edited it all. Well, they got the band signed. They said, the guy said, oh, come back, remix this. They just took the same stuff back. He said, oh, yeah, it's wonderful. And then they stopped it, but they released that as a record. They edited it together and released it. So,
trying to make what point? That the major labels were just inept?
I think that was a point where they were trying to make, where it had got so daft. I don't know what point they were trying to make that. Self-sabotaging, really. I would just making enemies rather than
making
friends.
Enemies, certainly. Yeah,
making enemies rather than friends. So I think if that later period, a lot of friends, 65, who you talked about, Gerard, 65, 66, 67, and then maybe making enemies, 68, 69, like the Nice, who Andrew fell out with, and he said,
yeah,
when they were doing, he wanted to poison them. And they had Amen Corner as well, and he wanted to kill Amen Corner. And Fleetwood Mac they had, and he said, oh, I'm getting rid of Fleetwood Mac. The guy butters his roll with the wrong knife. I'm getting rid of so making enemies, you know.
So happy, so much for happy to be part of the industry of human happiness. So, you know, a couple of things about this book. You know, the one is the sheer density of what the Americans would call bold-faced, bold-type names on every page, which is just the number of people involved in the number of people whose names you know who are involved in absolutely everything, you know. And so-and-so passes through, and so-and-so makes a record, and so-and-so falls out with somebody. And then the other thing is in almost every relationship ends with, and then Andrew fell out with them and threatened to kill them. It's what you would call a motif all the way through this book.
Yeah.
Well, one review, Chris Charlesworth, who is a melody maker journalist famous from the 70s, one of the lead ones in the 70s. He wrote a review of this book that compared Andrew to Boris Johnson, which Andrew didn't respond to that review. But and then threatened to kill them, or tickle them to death. I don't know, you know, what is, you know, but he was a great man. You know, there's no doubt about that. He was, there's no one who can hold a candle to him. And it really annoys me that Sir George Martin gets all the accolades for putting a trumpet on John Lennon's head, whereas Andrew has got this vast body. I know he's a crazy crackpot, and he upsets a lot of people. And when he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he refused to go because he fell out.
Well, what can you expect?
To kill.
You see, Andrew Oldham could no more stand up in front of a room full of people and go, well, I'm thrilled to be here and to have the honor
and make it sound convincing.
He wouldn't. It's not his style at all, you know.
Exactly.
It'd be completely off-brand to have gone in the first place. So he's right, really.
But he still retained, one of the things you mentioned in the book is, you know, he put Mick Jagger and Keith Richards in a room and said, write songs, and which they did. And then he did a deal for publishing where he continued to earn money from the early Rolling Stones catalogue. Is that the case?
63 to 73 he owns. I think it's 10% of the Rolling Stones songs.
That's
so he's quite happy when Martin Scorsese makes a movie.
Yeah, I bet.
That's the
stuff
He picked all that stuff up when he was 17, 18. He knew all that from hanging around with Phil Spector.
And Phil Spector gave him advice. That's why he signed, didn't he? He immediately was signed to a separate company and then leased out. And they owned some of the master tapes and stuff, didn't they?
Yeah, and as a kid, he worked for Mary Quant. So he saw how Mary Quant took what I guess was quite a niche, small boutique and made it world famous. So he'd seen what was possible, and couldn't get into he refused the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But I mean, I love him for all that. I do, but I think his records stand up. I mean, you've heard a lot of those immediate records. They're great 60s records. And he continued. He produced Bobby Womack in the 70s. Donovan's album's pretty good in the 70s. People even like Brett Smiley, who he did in the 70s.
It's a fantastic read, really is. And it also comes in a handy, robust edition, which you can put in your back pocket, which we think the back pocket is going to come back in a big way in publishing.
Oh, I'm hoping so. I'm hoping the back pocket, because I've been sliding it in the side pocket.
Oh, okay. Well,
and the front pocket of the hoodie.
Any pocket is possible. Yeah.
Any pocket is possible.
Yeah.
There he is.
Talk to you.
Immediate.
Pocket.
The rise and fall of the UK's first independent record label. Simon Spence, nice to talk to you.
Thank you very much, fellas. Thank you.